Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about Jatinder Mann's book, Redefining Citizenship in Australia, Canada, and Aotearoa New Zealand. So this book, the central thesis is basically that between the 1950s and the 1970s, foundational notions of citizenship and what it means to be a citizen, who's included in citizenship, and whether or not they're sort of tiered systems of citizenship fundamentally changes in these three countries, Australia, Canada, and Aotearoa New Zealand. What he argues is that in the 1950s, say at 1950, all three countries, their national identities and conceptions of citizenship were deeply integrated with British identity. They regarded themselves as British countries and part of the British world, which had the United Kingdom as its sort of main axis, and the Commonwealth countries, and at that point the remaining British colonies that had not yet gained independence, as the sort of external portions of a fundamentally British world that was centered on the United Kingdom. By 1970, this is no longer really the case. What Mann shows through his research is that by 1970, conceptions of citizenship in these three countries change in two main fundamental ways. And they're similar trajectories to these two changes, even though the different countries have slightly different timelines, different methodologies, etc., etc. But what Mann basically argues is that by 1970, citizenship in these three countries is no longer seen as more or less synonymous with with being a British subject. That citizenship is no longer tiered in the way that it had been, where immigrants who were British or from the Commonwealth, in other words, who were British subjects from other countries, had a different path to immigration and different rights as immigrants than immigrants to these three countries who came from non-British or non-Commonwealth countries. So other immigrants from other countries in Europe, from Asia, from Africa, non-British parts of Africa, etc., etc. They had a often longer path to citizenship that required more commitment, that often required renouncing their citizenship from their home country, and that had more conditions typically that allowed that citizenship in Australia, Canada, or Aotearoa New Zealand to be revoked. So that's the one side of things. The other trend that Mann shows is an attempt to, however imperfectly, expand citizenship rights for the indigenous peoples of each of these three countries. So Aboriginal Australians, First Nations, Inuit and Métis Canadians, and the Maori in Aotearoa New Zealand. This project remains unfinished today in 2025, so it was definitely unfinished in the 1970s when Mann's analysis breaks off. But during the 60s and 70s, there were these attempts to expand, the 50s, 60s, and 70s, there were these attempts to expand full citizenship to indigenous peoples, with the provisional problem that sometimes that expansion of citizenship rights was accompanied by a contraction or renunciation of rights that they had specifically as Indigenous peoples. This was especially the case, for instance, in Canada, where the Canadian government initially expanded the franchise, that is, the vote, to Indigenous people, but anyone who accepted that right to vote in Canadian national elections had to give up their status as a member of a tribe, nation, or band. And so people basically renounced their identity as Indigenous people, because one of the things that across these three countries that you see with their attempts to incorporate Indigenous people is that they are attempting to incorporate Indigenous people into the existing structures of Australian society, white Australian society, white Canadian society, primarily Anglophone Canadian, but also Francophone Canadian, and then white British Aotearoa New Zealand society. This is, of course, problematic in terms of the treatment of Indigenous people because it has a fundamentally assimilationist perspective, which many Indigenous people are not fans of. So you have all of that going on. What Mann does that's really kind of useful and cool in this book is he basically goes through sets of legislation, of documents, of white papers, things like this, that sort of trace this renegotiation of citizenship rights in each of these countries during the 3 decades that he's looking at. So the book is divided into 3 body chapters, one on Australia, one on Canada, and one on Aotearoa New Zealand. And I'm going to talk more about this, but each chapter is structured exactly the same way. And most of the body of these chapters is a sequence of sections about different documents, right? So starting with the earliest document from that country in the 1950s that takes on this question of citizenship, and going up through the latest document in the 1970s that takes on this question of citizenship. The first portion of it is focused on, the first portion of the documents section is focused on expansion to non-British immigrants, and then you have a sort of repetition of that chronology focused on the incorporation of Indigenous peoples. So it is a documents-based book that's fundamentally concerned with what were the contexts of these various pieces of legislation, policy, etc., etc. What were the purpose of them? What were they meant to do? What were the competing political positions about them, who supported them, who opposed them, and why, etc., etc. So it's very useful in that sense. There's a kind of almost archival type approach, even though Mann doesn't reproduce the original document. So this is not an archive in itself, but it is a sort of chronological analysis rooted in specific political documents. So I mentioned this, and I said that I was going to talk more about it. This is probably the most repetitive piece of professional scholarship that I've ever encountered. And I mean that on 2 levels. One is that, again, each of the chapters is set up exactly the same way, right? You start with an introduction that gives an overview of the chapter, an overview that basically has already been given in the introduction to the book itself. Then there's a section on the theoretical foundation, and the theoretical foundation. While he talks about different elements of theoretical foundation to a certain extent for each of the three countries, the basic framework is shared across them. Then there's a section on the death of the British world, which basically revolves around two instances. The Suez Crisis, in which Britain and France invaded Egypt to the chagrin of some people around the world and with the support of others around the world. Many in Canada were opposed to intervention in Egypt, whereas many in Canada supported it. On the other hand, Australia and New Zealand were pretty solidly on board with Britain going into Egypt to try and retake control of the Suez Canal. But then in the 1960s and then into the 70s, when Europe attempted to join and ultimately did join the European Economic Community, that was a much bigger concern for Australia and New Zealand because they had much less access to markets in the European Economic Community than they did markets within the Commonwealth. And so Australia especially lost a lot of trade with the United Kingdom as the United Kingdom turned toward Europe rather than the Commonwealth. So that's discussed in each chapter, and then he goes through the documents. On the one hand, I understand this. I understand the logic of doing this, because one of the things that I encountered actually when I published my scholarly book was publishers today, scholarly publishers, academic publishers, often want each chapter to be self-contained because they will sell electronic copies of the chapter itself. Rather than someone having to buy the whole book, if you just want to read a particular chapter, you buy that chapter. And so in that sense, it makes sense. It works. However, there's also just direct, copy-pasting type repetition. Let me find my examples of this because, so this is the first instance. This is not the first instance actually that I noticed, but this is the first instance that I wrote down. So this is within 2 pages, pages 4 to 5. The chapter summaries, actually. Pay attention to the phrasing you're about to hear. This is about Chapter 1 on Australia. In the 1950s, Australia very much identified itself as a British country and an integral part of a wider British world which had the UK at its centre. Chapter 2. In the 1950s, English-speaking Canada very much identified itself as a British country and an integral part of a wider British world which had the UK at its centre. Summarizing Chapter 3, in the 1950s, Aotearoa New Zealand very much identified itself as a British country and an integral part of a wider British world which had the UK at its heart. So we shift from center to heart there, but other than that, and other than the country names being changed, it is precisely the same. Then we get to the opening of the first chapter on Australia. In the 1950s, Australia very much identified itself as a British country and an integral part of a wider British world which had the UK at its centre. No points for guessing what the first sentence of chapters 2 and 3 sounds like. This phrasing then also shows up in the comparative conclusion that looks at similarities and differences between these three countries' experiences through from the 1950s to 70s, and it identifies comparison and contrast elements without really doing a massive argument about what those similarities and differences typically mean. So I don't understand that. I've never seen that before. On occasion, because it takes a long time to write a scholarly monograph, a scholarly book like this, you may use similar phrasing. You may even, in the course of revision, copy-paste something and forget that you had it in a different place. I understand that on occasion. But this exact same phrasing shows up over and over and over and over again. The writing is so repetitive. I don't understand why any editor was like, yeah, this is good. We want to publish this. I mean, it seems like such a bizarre thing. And at the level of content, and even at the level of understanding of the book, it's not really a problem. But it makes it so much harder to read and to enjoy.